Thank you very much, Chair. At the outset, let me say that the work you do is fantastic. The delivery of aid to the right place at the right time is something that we should all be concerned about, particularly when you talk about the abuse of women, children. I got a text last night which took high street fashion and showed where it had been made. So, you know, are you aware that a child cut this dress? Are you aware that a child was involved, this, that and the other? However, and there is a however, I'm looking at the expenditure of 2.137 billion over 10 years in overseas development aid. And I'm looking at the distribution of that. And what I want to do is outline some of that into distribution, and then I want to ask you a question on it. So I'm looking at Ethiopia, where we, over 10 years, 552,815, and the same country has a defence budget of 1.58 billion. Okay, so we're paying roughly a third of that. Mozambique, 299 million. We're actually covering the cost of their defence, which is 0.28 of a billion. Tanzania, 252 million. Uganda, 242 million. And I look at the military spend in each of these countries, and I say to myself, what's going on here? And I'll give you an analogy. If I agree to fund your children's education and to fund your children's health, you can go off and buy a big car and you can drive around town looking rather flash while I pay the cost of it. My question to you is, what sort of oversight is there in the money that is allocated to overseas development aid? And is it time that we stepped back, reviewed what countries we're providing aid to, and maybe switched the aid to countries that are far more in need than these countries that can splash out €1 billion on their defence? So I look at them, they have hundreds of soldiers, they have naval ships, they have air forces with modern jets. We don't have that. We cannot afford that in this country. We have one ship and we have no aircraft that is a jet. Yet I look at these countries and they have fighter jets. So I'm trying to figure out, are we allowing these countries to siphon off money from here to for education, for development, for health, while at the same time spending the money they should be spending on those things somewhere else? And I know it's a touchy area, but it needs to be addressed. I get emails all day, every day, on people telling me that we're wasting money in overseas development aid. So if you could address that for me, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, Jean-Anne.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much, Senator, for your question. I think if we look at, I think one of the key, obviously, policy areas for Ireland is around reaching the furthest behind, okay? And I think that's where one of the real strengths of our policy is that we're putting the individuals that are the furthest behind at the centre of our overseas aid programme. And that's really around actually targeting those individuals. So yes, you know, and I don't have the particular country examples that you mentioned, but the reality is that we can actually, through our overseas aid programme, we can target the individuals that need it the most, regardless of whether their governments are doing that or not. And I think that's where it is really about putting the individuals, and whether it's children, women, at the centre of our policy, and those who are most affected by the devastating impacts of climate, conflict or others. I think when it comes to the kind of oversight piece, we know that approximately, I think 17% of the overseas aid programme goes to NGOs, and there is considerable oversight, you know, in terms of through the different programs that Irish Aid run with their partners, many of whom are here today, around that spending. And I think it is, you know, we do see a significant amount of money is being channeled through multilateral organisations, obviously through bilateral aid as well, through other channels, and we would welcome kind of additional oversight in terms of how that money is being spent and how that actually is ensuring that it is reaching those who are furthest behind. I don't know, Carol, if you want to add to anything.
I mean, I think the accountability needs to be there for the money, but I think as Jane Ann said, it's the commitment to reach the furthest behind. I think if we look at the overall global spending on military, it is very concerning. It's in the trillions, 2.4 trillion, I think, for 2023. And certainly, growing conflict is a reality for many countries, but there is a strong argument to be made that growing defence and security policies is not reducing those conflicts. So I think in the global context, I think that's a very valid question to raise around the increased military spending and the increased securitization of responses and the decreased outcome for people at in their basic safety and their outcomes. And I know that, certainly as NGOs, and we can speak to our part of what we deliver, we are, very much accountable for how we spend that money in terms of reaching the furthest behind, and that people in those countries, they are experiencing poverty and inequality for reasons within their country, but also some of the global issues that I outlined. And it's while we have those concerns, and I think that's why it's so important in our foreign policy, we are, really pushing human rights and those values as, that are core and that offer something Ireland really unique in the global space. But we should also question those big patterns around increased military spending globally, I think.
When you talk about the meeting those furthest behind, I mean, that's a very noble thing to do, but do you then point the spotlight on the government of the particular country to show that they're leaving the most deprived, the most impoverished, and leaving them to the mercy of NGOs? I mean, it strikes me that if we pump money in, and you're talking about a significant amount of money here, if we pump money in and we do not have a clear audit track that we can follow every euro that's put out and know exactly where it goes to. My fear is, you say 17% is at the NGO figure, so the rest is going in bilateral aid and various other. So we could be propping up warlords all over the place and missing the target you guys want to hit. Is that a fair point?
Well, I think that it probably would be that this might be a question or a clarification question to the department, because I think there's definitely an oversight of how that money is spent. But I think we would definitely be coming from a position where we see where we believe aid is most effectual, and that's really in supporting local communities, local civil society organisations, women's groups, farming groups, really ensuring that at a grassroots level that our funding is having the impact that we want and reaching those who are furthest behind. And I think that's really where we do want to see Ireland kind of scale up, is really around that locally led delivery piece and ensuring that actually we are really supporting those individuals who are affecting change within their own communities.
And are your accounts publicly available and for people to scrutinise on your website?
Yes, yeah. We have, we've got 56 members, so all of the international development and humanitarian organisations, and they would all have audited accounts and really be able to detail exactly where money is being spent and how.
Going back to my military days, every now and then we had a random audit of our barracks. So people would arrive from wherever and come in and check everything out. Are there random audits of the expenditure that you guys go through?
Yeah, I can ask Rachel perhaps just to give your example of concern, perhaps.
I actually just brought our annual report here, which is just published. But we are audited on a regular basis by all our donors. And I agree with you absolutely on the weapons expenditure. It's very hard to stomach. It's also very hard to understand when you say you have 2.4 trillion spent on weapons on an annual basis, but also it's very difficult to square the fact that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are also the biggest producers of weapons. And then we're caught in the middle of all of that. And I think that's where the work that Ireland did on the Sustainable Development Goals to really try and focus all political efforts on doing better and doing good. I think one of the biggest challenges that we will face collectively. I mean, a lot of aid, if you look at the countries that have recovered significantly from conflict alone, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, all countries where the work of development actors, NGOs, UN agencies and so on provided alternatives to conflict, and that's just one part of the work that we do, and I think the impact of Ireland's global contribution is immense. I was at the Protection of Civilians Week in New York 2 weeks ago, and to see the work of Ireland on trying to address the impact of explosive weapons, for example, trying to quantify the impact that explosive weapons will have for decades and decades on children who will need prosthetic limbs for the rest of their lives and so on. So, I think we should absolutely question how we spend our money and making sure that there is value for money in everything that we do and in Ireland's aid budget. But I think, as I outlined at the beginning, we're in a very difficult space in the world, and Ireland is one of the leading countries on trying to put peace before conflict, trying to really ensure that education, access to water, the most basic human rights are at the centre of foreign policy, and I think that's really essential.
My last question, when we took over on the United Nations Security Council, the first statement that was made was that Ireland stood with the women and girls of Afghanistan. Have we had any impact, or do you have people working in Afghanistan? Have we had any impact on the women and girls? I mean, I cannot imagine what it must be like for a young woman in, say, 18 to 25 who had the benefit of education while the forces were there, and suddenly to be thrown back into the dark ages and to see, I still can't understand how a father would stand by and allow his daughter to be brought up illiterate and uneducated. But, I mean, have you got people there, and are you having any impact?
Okay, I'll answer that. I mean, Concern is in Afghanistan and has stayed in Afghanistan throughout. It's very, very difficult to continue to program, and the impact of some of the restrictions that are put on how we work and how women can work, and I think what we do is reaching the furthest behind Afghanistan is a really good example. I think the worst thing that any organisation ever has to do is to leave a country when it's impossible to work. So for now, it's not impossible for us to work in Afghanistan. We do a huge amount on food security, on working with communities, and we do the very best that we can, and it's very difficult, but we're still there.
Okay, well, thank you for your service. Thank you, very much appreciated.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much, Senator Craughwell. I just want to come back to you on a couple of those points. I also think we need to think about the kind of counterfactual of an under-resourced military in Ethiopia and what that looks like. I think if you look at the history of the African continent over the last 3 decades, we actually need properly resourced and professionally run militaries across Africa who are operating professionally and respecting international humanitarian law. I've worked personally in a lot of contexts alongside African Union peacekeepers and UN peacekeepers, and I can tell you that the vast bulk of contributing countries now are African countries themselves to African missions. So in a lot of ways, this is African solutions to African problems, and those peacekeepers are not going to come out of nowhere. They need to come from professionally resourced militaries. And Ethiopia is in a very particularly tricky part of the world. And I think, while it needs to be proportionate spending, and I think we need to put it in the context of global military spending. I don't necessarily think a complete about-face in that respect is in the interest of the continent or the interest of global peace and security. You talked about the figure of around 520 million in terms of what Ireland has invested. I want to put that in context. The United States Agency for International Development estimates that just the annual cost for mitigating the effects of climate change just in Ethiopia is $250 million a year. Okay? So I think that we need to collectively shift our mindset a little bit. And in a lot of ways, I think we're failing to see the wood for the trees if we're looking at what Ethiopia is spending on their military. Carol talked about what the next climate financing target is going to be at the next COP.
5 trillion possibly.
Pardon me, $5 trillion. So I think collectively we need a bit of a mindset shift, and we need to start seeing the wood from the trees.
If I can come back on a couple of things. First and foremost, you have reinforced the argument to get rid of the triple lock, because as long as the triple lock is in place, we will not be able to go unilaterally to Africa and assist in peacekeeping programs, which is something we should, as a mature nation, be able to do. Where you have a dysfunctional United Nations Security Council, we should be able to make our own decision. And you're 100% correct. I was at a briefing this morning, in fact, and it was all about how Africa is providing peacekeeping services for Africa. And we have a phenomenal record going back to the 1960s in that area. So we need to rid ourselves of the shackles that prevent us from acting as a mature nation and going there. But when you talk about the need for Ethiopia, for example, to have a viable security force, Ireland needs a viable security force as well and can't afford it. So, I mean, that has to be taken in context from my perspective, because defence and security is the area that I'm most interested in. But I don't for 1 minute think that we should be taking away money from the work you're doing. I just want to be sure that the money you're getting is going into the right areas, and that we are not propping up some goddamn warlord in some village or some town. From that point of view, we've got to be seeing development. Remember, I was born into the agricultural society that was Ireland, and thanks to the chairman, won't forgive me here, but thanks to Sean Lamass, we moved into the industrial age, and I would say thanks to the more recent Fine Gael governments, we've moved into the information age. So development in this country there were steps and there were value for money, and it was accounted for, and we have become an extremely wealthy country. The same can apply in Africa with the right type of leadership, and it bothers me that we still have warlords in some parts of that country. So I fully accept what you're saying. If you want, I'm trying to put things in context for myself and for those that I deal with. I don't want to in any way diminish what you do. What you do is amazing work. I cannot for a moment begin to imagine what it must be like for Concern working in Afghanistan. So, Mike, congratulations to all of you, and thank you for the work you're doing.
Okay, thanks, Senator. Ms. Bath, I think reserve.
Yeah, just to perhaps it's important just to be clear about Irish aid and the money there, because I think it is audited, and in fact the OECD DAC does an aid effectiveness review, and I think as civil society we would welcome certain changes, but I think overall it is very warmly welcomed as being an effective aid programme and really reaching the furthest behind. And from talking to civil society in Africa, in Latin America, they know Ireland is a different type of a donor, and certainly our own experience, again with Ethiopia, where civil society is severely restricted and has been in many cases, the embassy plays a really important role there in supporting civil society and supporting values like like human rights and women's rights. So I think just to be clear that, you know, there are audits, and then Irish Aid would have its own internal auditing. So I think just we do need to be cautious not to suggest that the money is going to warlords when there are there are systems and processes around aid effectiveness and Irish Aid's accountability. And then just lastly, in terms of your question, are we coming in and how are we engaging in our aid programmes around people's engagement with the government in those countries? And Action Aid, like many other DOCA's members, takes a human rights-based approach to poverty. So part of that is about addressing the needs of those communities. When you've got an extreme crisis, people are hungry, they're desperate, you have to meet those needs. But it's also about working with people using human rights as a lens to say, actually, you have a right to water, you have a right to education, the government should be applying this, working with women's groups to look at, how is the government providing funding for gender-based violence shelters, how are they providing for girls access to education, all of those kind of things. So the communities that we work with, there is always that extra layer of how do we now claim these rights and build that social contract in a given country.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Connell again.
Yeah, just very briefly. I also think you have to go back to Carol's point on how the international finance system is structured, and the fact that African countries are accessing markets on the absolute worst terms. And I have no doubt that there are preferential arrangements for financing military infrastructure, but then when you turn to the international markets to fund education systems and health systems, they are being charged unsustainable interest rates, which brings you into the debt trap that Carol talked about.